The waitress who refused to serve a rude man. He took off his sunglasses and she froze. It started with a glare, sharp, tired, impatient. The kind of look that told the world it existed only to annoy him. When he walked into the small-town diner, the air seemed to tighten. He sat at the corner booth, sunglasses on despite the dim light, and ordered in a tone that sounded more like a command than a request. Black coffee, hot. That was all he said. No greeting, no glance, no thank you. Mara Ellis, who had worked double shifts all week, wasn't in the mood for arrogance. She'd served rude customers before, truckers, city tourists, even a mayor once, but something about this man's tone rubbed against her sense of dignity. "Excuse me?" she asked, lowering her notepad. "Would you like to try that again?" The diner went silent. Fawkes paused mid-air. Her co-worker Jamie widened her eyes in warning. Nobody talked back to customers, especially not the kind who wore designer watches and carried themselves like they owned the ground they walked on. The man slowly raised his head. His jaw was sharp, his posture perfect, his expression unreadable behind those dark lenses. "You work here to serve coffee, don't you?" His voice was calm but condescending, the kind that came from people who believed they were above apology. Mara crossed her arms. "And I do, to polite people." That was when something in him shifted, barely, like a twitch in his facade. Then, without another word, he took off his sunglasses. The diner light caught his eyes. Pale blue, tired but strangely haunted. The kind of eyes that looked like they'd forgotten how to rest. He stared at her for a long second, then exhaled quietly as if something inside him had broken loose. "Fine," he said softly. "Please." That single word disarmed her more than any insult could have. "Before we go further, take a moment. Subscribe to feel more real stories like this one. Stories about moments that change people when they least expect it." Mara blinked, suddenly unsure. "Coming right up," she murmured, turning to the coffee machine, but the quiet in her chest was gone. She could still feel his gaze, not arrogant anymore, just exhausted. The man, Alexander Rohn, wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere without a purpose. Billionaire CEO, founder of Rohn Industries, he was a man who measured life in assets, not emotions. But tonight, he had driven 3 hours from the city, away from a board meeting and a shallow engagement party, to escape the life everyone thought he wanted. The car had broken down near the highway. The diner was the only place open. He just needed caffeine and silence, not a waitress who looked at him like he was human. Mara placed the steaming cup in front of him. "Here," she said. "It's on the house," he frowned. "I can pay." "I know." Her tone was soft now, no longer defensive. "But you look like you've had enough taken from you tonight." Her words hit him harder than she could have known. He studied her. This woman with flour on her apron, freckles across her cheeks, and eyes that seemed too kind for someone who worked 12-hour days. She didn't know who he was. Or maybe she didn't care. That alone made her more dangerous than anyone he'd met in years. "Do you always talk to customers like that?" he asked finally. "Only the ones who need it," she replied, walking away. The night stretched. He sat there long after his coffee had gone cold, watching her move between tables with an ease that didn't belong to someone struggling. Every gesture was deliberate, full of quiet grace. Every smile, even to the grumpy regulars, seemed genuine. He couldn't remember the last time someone looked at the world that way. When she came back to clear his cup, he asked, "Do you ever stop?" "Stop what?" "Caring." She froze, the question heavier than it sounded. "Not everyone can afford to," she said softly. Her answer stayed with him long after he left. The next morning, Mara arrived for her shift to find the booth he'd sat in empty, but cleaner than usual. On the table was a folded napkin, untouched except for a single word written in black ink. "Thank you," that should have been the end of it. But it wasn't, because Alexander came back the next night, and the one after that. At first she thought it was coincidence, but billionaires didn't drink coffee at the same small-town diner 3 nights in a row. They didn't ask about the specials or quietly watch a waitress talk to regulars like family. And they certainly didn't start leaving tips in the form of questions, each one scribbled neatly on napkins beside the cup. The first said, "Why this job?" The second, "What keeps you here?" The third, "Do you believe people can change?" She answered none of them. But every time she saw him, She found herself thinking about how she would have. The town began to whisper. "That man's from the city," one customer said. "Drives a car worth more than the whole block." Mara shrugged it off. It didn't matter. He was just a man who liked coffee. Or so she told herself. But that night, as the lights dimmed and the rain tapped softly on the diner windows, she saw him outside, standing by his car, staring at the ring of light spilling from the door, as if unsure whether to come back in. She didn't know yet that the man who made the world kneel couldn't remember the last time someone told him no, and that the first woman who did had just become the only person he couldn't forget. Alexander didn't return for 2 days. For someone like Mara, that should have meant nothing. Customers came and went. It wasn't her place to notice. But as she poured coffee into strangers' cups, her eyes kept flicking toward the corner booth, the one he always chose, the one that now sat painfully empty. It wasn't attraction, she told herself. It was curiosity, or maybe confusion. People like him didn't belong in places like this. They didn't linger in small diners or ask quiet questions about belief and change. And yet, in those brief moments, he had looked less like a billionaire and more like a man quietly trying to remember what being alive felt like. On the third night, the bell over the diner door chimed, and he was there again, same posture, same sunglasses, but something was different. The air around him seemed heavier, his movements slower. When he took his seat, he didn't speak. He just sat there watching the rain streak down the glass. Mara hesitated before approaching. "You're back," she said, her tone neutral, as if she hadn't been waiting. "Seems that way," he replied, his voice low. "You remembered me." Hard to forget someone who wears sunglasses at night. For the first time, she saw the faintest ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Fair point. She poured his coffee and he thanked her. A real thank you this time, quiet, sincere. He stayed for hours. He didn't talk much and she didn't press him. But when the last customers left and the diner emptied, he asked suddenly, "Do you ever feel trapped?" She looked up from wiping the counter. "By what?" "Routine, expectations, the same walls every day." She tilted her head, studying him. "You sound like someone who has every door open but doesn't know where any of them lead." He didn't answer. The silence between them stretched, not awkward, but charged with the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. Outside, the neon sign buzzed faintly against the rain. Inside, she could hear his steady breathing, controlled and tired, like a man holding together something fragile. "Why this diner?" she asked quietly. "You could be anywhere." "Why here?" He looked down at his cup. "Because here no one knows me, and for a few minutes I don't have to be him." "Him who?" He hesitated, then said, "The man who ruined everything that mattered trying to prove he didn't care." She didn't know what to say. There was something raw in his voice, the kind of vulnerability people like him weren't supposed to show. Before she could respond, Jamie called from the back, breaking the moment. "Mara, we're closing in 5. When she turned back, Alexander was already standing, his jacket draped over one arm. "Thank you," he said again, slipping a folded bill under the saucer. Mara sighed. "Oh, you don't have to tip so much." "I know," his tone softened. "It's not for the coffee." That night, when she counted the register, she found another napkin. This one had only 2 words, "Not for long." The next morning, Alexander's assistant, a composed woman named Evelyn, stood outside his penthouse office with a folder in hand. "Sir, the Zurich deal needs your signature before noon, and the board is asking if you're still attending the merger dinner." Alexander barely looked up from the window. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, glittering and lifeless. "Cancel it." "Cancel which, sir?" "All of it," she blinked. "Excuse me?" He turned. "The dinner." "The meetings." "The interviews." "Cancel everything for the week." Evelyn hesitated. She had worked for him long enough to know not to question. But this was different. "If I may ask, what should I tell them?" He picked up his phone, staring briefly at the photo on the screen. A picture from an event last year, his arm around a woman in diamonds, smiling like strangers. "Tell them," he said quietly, "I'm unavailable." For the first time in his career, Alexander Rohn simply disappeared. That afternoon, the sleek black car pulled up outside the diner again. When Mara saw it through the window, her heart did something strange, something she refused to name. He walked in without his sunglasses this time. His eyes met hers immediately. There was no arrogance, no shield, just exhaustion and something else, something she couldn't quite place. "So you're early today," she said, setting down her tray. "Didn't sleep," he replied. "Coffee helps, or it keeps you awake." He gave a quiet laugh. "You'd make a terrible barista in my world. I'm not built for your world." "You say that like it's a bad thing." She froze for a second. There it was again, that flicker of something human beneath all the wealth, the faintest trace of warmth he couldn't quite hide. As she turned to refill the pot, an older man at the counter muttered to another, "That's him. The Roan guy from the news, billionaire, fired 100 people last month." Mara heard it. She tried not to look at him differently, but she couldn't help it. The name echoed in her chest. Alexander Roan, the man who bought companies the way others bought coffee. The man known for walking away from anything that didn't serve his plans. When she came back, her voice was quiet. "Is it true you're that Roan?" He didn't deny it. "I was. And now?" He met her gaze steadily. "Now I'm someone trying to remember what being decent feels like." Mara's throat tightened. "You're sitting in a diner to do that?" "I'm sitting in your diner." The words landed between them like something fragile and unfinished. For a long moment she couldn't look away. And for the first time since she met him, she saw not the billionaire, but the man. He wasn't unreachable, just lost. When her shift ended, he was still there. And as she walked out into the night, she glanced back through the glass. He was watching her go. The man who could have anything, sitting alone in a booth, chasing the one thing he didn't know how to buy. And that was the moment she realized. He wasn't here for the coffee. He was here for her. The third week brought wind that rattled the diner's old windows, and a rumor that rattled everything else. Someone had recognized him. Not everyone in a small town reads financial news, but someone always does. And by morning a whisper was circling the counter like steam off fresh coffee. The rude man with the sunglasses wasn't just rich. He was Alexander Roan. Mara felt the whisper before she heard it. It lived in the small pauses when she set down plates, in the sideways glances that lingered too long. Jamie tried to shield her from it with jokes, but even jokes have edges. "Careful," she murmured as they crossed behind the counter. "You keep talking to him like that, and the internet will put you in a billionaire love story." Mara rolled her eyes, though heat touched her cheeks. "It's not a story. It's a man who needed coffee." Jamie lowered her voice. "And something else. He arrived just before the lunch rush, not his usual hour. No sunglasses, no armor." He paused at the door as if asking the room for permission to enter, then crossed to his booth and sat with his hands folded, waiting. The cook peered through the pass like a cautious animal. Two mechanics at the counter stopped mid-sentence. The town had never been this close to a headline before. Mara went to him with a pad she didn't need. "Rough morning?" "Rough life," he said, then huffed at himself. "I'm sorry." That sounded dramatic. "Coffee would be great." "Black," she said, remembering. "Hot." He smiled, brief and real. When she returned, he lifted the cup but didn't drink. "They know," he said quietly, eyes on the rim. "About me?" She leaned her elbow on the table, an act of trust or defiance. She wasn't sure which. "And? I didn't come to make trouble for you." "You didn't," she said. "Trouble walks in here on its own." A mother with a stroller wrestled the door. Wind clawed at her coat. Without thinking, Alexander stood, crossed the room and caught the handle so the baby wouldn't jolt. He stayed there until she passed, then closed the door gently as if it might bruise. When he returned to his booth, he avoided Mara's eyes, embarrassed by how human he'd been. "Thank you," the mother called after him. "That was kind." He nodded, almost boyish, and sat. Mara set down a slice of apple pie he hadn't ordered. He looked at it, then at her. "Routine can be softened," she said. He laughed under his breath. "You talk like you're saving me." "I'm not," she said. "But I might be saving my own faith in people." The room slowly remembered its forks and conversations. For a while, time loosened. He ate in silence. She moved through the diner with that steady intention he'd come to crave. When the lull arrived, the sacred quiet between lunch and the first early dinners, she slid into the far side of his booth. Not quite opposite him, not quite beside. The careful geography of two people learning the borders of a forbidden love they wouldn't name. "Why the sunglasses?" she asked softly. "The first night." He stared at his hands. When he spoke, the words came gloved in honesty. My father taught me that power is never having to flinch. The glasses helped. I could look without being seen. And now? Now I'm tired of not being seen. A truck rumbled past, rattling the glass. The cook flipped a sign to refill the soup. Normal sounds, ordinary life. Yet the air around their booth felt like a hush in a chapel. She gestured to the napkins he'd left on other nights. You asked if people can change. I did. Do you want to? Or do you want people to believe you did? He absorbed it without defense. It looked almost painful, like a muscle learning a new motion. I want to change, he said at last. Belief can come later. Mara nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the road that leads to it. The bell chimed. A man in a tailored coat stepped in and scanned the room as if counting assets. He found Alexander and came straight over. Sir, he said, low and urgent, you need to leave. Evelyn sent you. Alexander asked, not bothering to hide his annoyance. She did. There are photographers setting up at the gas station across the street. Someone tipped them. The board is furious. Mara felt a cold line trace her spine. She looked past the man's shoulder. Through the diner window, she could see a black SUV idle by the curb, windows tinted like secrets. The town would feast on this for weeks. In the corner, Jamie mouthed, "Are you okay?" Mara nodded, though her hands had gone still. Alexander didn't move. "I'm not hiding." "It isn't just about you," the man pressed. His eyes flicked to Mara, measuring warning. "It will damage her." "They'll say what they say." Mara absorbed the implication with a composure she wore like her apron. "Let them," she said. "I'm not a rumor. I'm a person." The man softened a degree. "Miss, I'm sure you are. But the internet doesn't make room for that." "Then maybe it should," Alexander said, the steel back in his voice tempered now by something gentler. "Thank you, Greg. That'll be all." Greg hesitated, then retreated to the door where he stood guard like a human storm barrier. Mara exhaled. "You can still go. It might protect the diner." "Leaving to protect you," he said, "feels too much like the old me solving problems with disappearance." "I don't need you to be a martyr," she answered. "I need you to be decent." The words landed between them and cracked open something he'd sealed shut. He looked around. The scuffed floor, the tired neon, the merciless tenderness with which this place held its ordinary lives. "I can do decent," he said. "I can learn." A little boy at the counter dropped his milk. It splashed shock white against tile, and silence fell as the child's face crumpled. Before Mara could move, Alexander was there with napkins. Kneeling so calmly, the boy's panic dissolved into giggles. He wiped the spill, apologized to the mother for the mess he hadn't made, and carried the empty glass back to the counter for a refill, as if he'd done it all his life. When he returned, Mara watched him with a quiet she didn't know how to disguise. "You're good with children," she said. He looked at his hands again, that new habit of humility. "No one taught me. And maybe that's why I'm trying." The SUV door across the street opened. A camera glinted. Greg tensed. The cook muttered a prayer he didn't believe in. This, Mara realized, was the price of visibility. Rich man, poor woman, the sort of class difference romance people like to chew up in tabloids and call a true love story just to see it break. She had dodged 1,000 small violences working here. She wasn't sure she could dodge this one. Alexander saw it land in her face, the calculation, the fear, the refusal to let fear win. He leaned in, low enough that only she could hear. "Say the word," he whispered, "and I'll make them vanish." "All of them. That's not how this works," she said gently. "You can buy silence, but you can't buy respect." He shut his eyes just for a second, as if the truth stung. When he opened them, the blue was steadier. "Then tell me how to earn it." "By standing here when the picture isn't flattering," she said. "By not turning people into liabilities. By not turning me into a headline." He nodded once, like a vow. The door swung open again. A woman strode in, wearing confidence like perfume. Sleek navy suit, fine heels. A face you trusted until you learned better. "Evelyn," Mara guessed. No, this woman's smile had edges. "Alexander," she said, as if scolding a child who'd wandered. "We need to manage this." He didn't rise. "Hello, Margaret. Not Evelyn." The name dropped like a coin into a well. Margaret's eyes slid to Mara and back. "So this is the waitress." She made the word sound like a diagnosis. "Ms. Ellis," Mara said, standing straight. "Ms. Ellis." Margaret's smile didn't reach anything living. I represent the interests that keep Mr. Roan's world from burning down. You understand what's at stake? Mara held her gaze. People. That's what's at stake. Reputation, Margaret corrected. Market confidence. We'll pay for your discretion and your absence. Generously. Alexander's chair scraped the tile. No, Margaret didn't look at him. You can afford to say that. She cannot. Mara felt heat rise. Not shame, not even rage, but the moral courage that had carried her through lean years and long nights. I can afford to have a spine, she said quietly. I won't be bought. Not to leave. Not to lie. For the first time, something flickered in Margaret's expression. Annoyance, then calculation, then a cruel kind of admiration. You think decency wins? This is a game of pressure, not purity. Then switch games, Mara said. Alexander stepped between them without touching either, a line drawn with his body. This is over, he told Margaret. If you can't protect what makes us worth believing in, then you don't represent me anymore. You'd risk everything for this? Margaret asked, almost curious. For the optics of a romantic drama with a woman who thinks love beyond money is a strategy, not a liability. Not optics, he said, voice low. Integrity, Margaret's smile returned, thinner now. Then be brave, both of you. The cameras are waiting. She left on the word waiting as if it pleased her to let the storm do what storms do. In the window's reflection, the lens blinked. Greg's shoulders squared. The mother with the stroller looked small and fiercely protective. Mara's breath slowed. Alexander's didn't. He turned to her. Tell me what to do, he said, and there was no boardroom in it. No command. Only a man asking for a map. She reached for the coffee pot and, with a steadiness she felt down to her bones, poured into his cup until it brimmed. We do what we were already doing, she said. We act like people. We don't perform, he stood. The room felt taller with him upright and unafraid. He offered his hand, not to claim, not to declare, but to share weight on an unsteady floor. Mara looked at it, then at his face, and placed her hand in his. Warm, firm, human. The bell rang as the door opened, and the first photographer stepped inside, breath fogging, eyes hungry. He raised the camera, and the flash lifted a white square of light across the diner, freezing everything for the smallest slice of time. Their joined hands, the mother's clenched jaw, Greg's guard stance, Jamie's defiant chin, the pie cooling in its glass case. The room exhaled when the light vanished. The photographer lowered his camera, surprised by how little scandal looked like scandal, when people refused to act ashamed and still. Outside, a second door opened. A second engine idled. A second shape stepped out. Someone Margaret had clearly kept in reserve. Someone the city would recognize even faster than a billionaire. Mara watched the silhouette cross the glass and felt her pulse change. Alexander saw her face and turned, all color leaving his own. The woman beaming on the threshold wore a diamond a town could live on for a year. Alex, she sang to the room he'd tried to keep small and safe. So you left our engagement party early. I've been looking everywhere. For a long moment, no one moved. The name Alex hung in the air like a dropped glass, right before it shatters. The woman's presence changed the temperature of the diner. Everything felt sharper, colder, more fragile. Mara didn't need an introduction to understand who she was. The ring, the dress, the perfect posture. This wasn't someone who worked for Alexander. This was someone who owned a piece of him, the diners, who had been whispering about tabloids and billionaires all morning. Fell into the kind of silence you only hear in small towns when something sacred or scandalous is happening right before their eyes. The mother with the stroller pulled her child a little closer. Jamie stopped pretending to wipe a table and just watched, eyes wide. Alexander's jaw clenched, but his shoulders didn't rise. Clara, he said, his voice level, almost gentle. I shouldn't be here. Clara laughed softly, a sound with edges. You say that like I ever listen. You vanish from our engagement party, ignore my calls, and this is where you've been hiding. Her eyes swept the diner, landing on the cracked leather booths and faded posters before fixing on Mara. And with her? Please don't, Alexander said. Not here. Oh, I think here is perfect, Clara said, her gaze flicking between them. Because this, she gestured at Mara's uniform, the coffee cups, the ordinary world around them, is exactly what you always pretended to despise. You built empires just to escape places like this. Mara straightened, her heart thudding but her voice steady. Maybe he came back because he missed being treated like a person. Clara turned, lips curling into a practiced smile. And you must be the moral compass. Every rich man seems to find one when he's bored. The insult didn't sting the way it should have. Mara had endured worse from customers, and something about Clara's elegance, how heavy it looked, how lonely, made her more sad than angry. If he's bored, she said quietly, he hides it well. Alexander's hand brushed the table, close to hers but not touching. Clara, go home. Home? Clara echoed, her laughter breaking for the first time. You mean the mansion full of people who pretend to like us? The one you built so you could sleep alone in a separate wing? Don't lecture me about home, Alex. You left that behind a long time ago. The air between them was too full, too honest. Mara stepped back. I'll give you two a minute. But Alexander caught her voice before she could move. Stay. That single word froze everyone again. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. Clara crossed her arms. You can't be serious. He looked at her then, really looked, without the armor, without anger, just weary truth. For once I am. The wind outside rattled the door. Somewhere the coffee machine hissed like punctuation. Clara exhaled, her control finally slipping. I've seen this before, she said. The phase where you try to feel human again. It doesn't last, it will, he said simply. Because this time I'm not pretending. The diner's lights buzzed faintly. Mara felt like the world had gone still around a single heartbeat. Theirs. Clara's jaw trembled, but her voice sharpened again. You'll regret this. She'll take one look at who you really are and run. Mara met her eyes. Maybe, she said softly. But I'll decide that myself. Clara flinched as if struck, then turned and walked out, her heels hitting the floor in perfect, furious rhythm. Outside, cameras clicked like lightning. When the door shut, the whole diner exhaled at once. Jamie muttered, I feel like I just watched a movie, and someone shushed her. Mara looked at Alexander. His face was unreadable now, not cold, not proud, just quiet. You didn't have to say that, she murmured. Yes, he said, I did, because you wanted to make a point? Because it was true. He stood, the weight of the moment still settling around him. I'm sorry, he added, and the apology was meant for her, for the room, maybe even for himself. I didn't want you in the middle of this. I'm already in it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Whether I want to be or not. He studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing it in the quiet before everything changed. Then he slipped his wallet from his jacket, pulled out a card and set it on the table. It wasn't the gesture of a man trying to impress. It was the gesture of someone offering an escape route. If this ruins your job or your name, I can help. I don't want your money, she said. He nodded once. Then tell me what you want. Mara didn't answer right away, because she didn't know. Because part of her still wanted him to leave, to make it easier, cleaner, safer. But another part, the part that had seen the way he bent down to wipe spilled milk, wanted him to stay. I want you to be the man you were when you did that, she said finally, motioning toward the counter where the little boy had laughed. Not the one they write about. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in years, Alexander Rohn didn't feel like a man who owned half the world. He felt like a man trying to find where he belonged in it. The door opened again, just enough to let in a gust of cold air and a voice from outside. Mr. Rohn, a reporter shouted, are you ending your engagement? Is she the reason? He flinched at the sound. So did Mara. I should go, he said quietly. Probably, she whispered. But you'll come back. He hesitated, hand on the door. How do you know? Because you haven't finished your coffee, she said, glancing at the cup half full and cooling on the table. That made him smile, the first real one she'd seen. You always notice the details. Someone has to, she said. He nodded, stepped outside into the noise, and for a moment the flashbulbs swallowed him whole. Then the door closed, and the diner was ordinary again. Jamie leaned on the counter, still staring. You realize that was like the richest man in the country, right? Mara sighed, picking up his empty plate. He's just a man. Yeah, Jamie said. But you just made him look like one. Mara tried to smile, but her heart wasn't steady. Because she didn't know what would happen next, or how a man like him could fit into a life like hers. All she knew was that something had shifted. And whatever came after this, nothing in her small, predictable world would ever be small again. Outside, through the glass, she watched Alexander get into the car, cameras still flashing. He turned his head just before the door closed, meeting her gaze through the window. For a second, everything between them, the class difference, the money, the risk, fell away. There was only recognition, and then he was gone. But as she wiped the counter, something caught her eye, something small gleaming left behind under the napkin dispenser. It was a ring, gold, delicate, too beautiful to belong to anyone who worked there. Mara froze, realizing it wasn't hers. It wasn't Clara's either. It was his. Mara held the ring in her palm as if it were something alive. The metal was warm, like it had absorbed the pulse of the man who'd just worn it. Around the inside, faintly engraved, were words so small she almost missed them. "For the day I learned to feel again." Her heart clenched. It wasn't a wedding band, not a symbol of possession or promise. It was something older, personal, private. The kind of thing a man like Alexander Rohn would never lose unless he was too distracted to notice. She placed it carefully inside her apron pocket, unsure why she didn't immediately call after him. Maybe it was because he had already been pulled back into that storm of flashbulbs and questions. Or maybe it was because part of her wanted to keep this small piece of him safe. The diner buzzed for hours after he left. Customers whispered his name in disbelief. Reporters tried to peek through the fogged glass, and Jamie replayed the moment 100 times, embellishing it like it was already a legend. But for Mara, it didn't feel exciting. It felt heavy, like she was carrying someone else's secret. That night, long after the diner had closed, she walked home through the drizzle, the city lights shimmering in the puddles. Her neighborhood smelled of rain and fried onions, familiar and safe. Yet her mind was full of that quiet look he'd given her, the kind that felt like an unfinished sentence. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the ring on her palm again. Under the light, the engraving caught the glow like a whisper. She thought of his controlled voice, the loneliness that lived behind his composure, the way he'd said stay. And for the first time, she realized she wanted to understand him, not the billionaire in the headlines, but the man behind that impossible restraint. Still, she wasn't foolish. Men like Alexander didn't cross bridges like that. Not for waitresses, not for people like her. The next morning, the diner was quieter than usual. Jamie kept glancing at the door every time it jingled, expecting him to return. He didn't. Days passed, then weeks. The storm of gossip around his public breakup grew, then moved on to newer scandals. Life settled again. Almost. But every time Mara slipped her hand into her apron, the ring reminded her that something unfinished lingered in the air. Until one evening. It was raining again, harder this time. The kind of rain that made even the neon lights look tired. Mara was wiping down the counter when the door opened. A man stepped in, soaked but calm, his eyes steady behind raindrops and exhaustion. Alexander. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. No sunglasses, no armor, just a dark coat clinging to his shoulders, his hair wet, his hands trembling slightly as he brushed them through it. The room froze again, but this time the silence wasn't from awe. It was from surprise, because this man didn't look like the billionaire who had owned the room weeks ago. He looked like someone searching for a place to breathe. Mara felt her throat tighten. "You're soaked," she said quietly. He managed a faint smile. "It seems to be a habit of mine, showing up where I shouldn't in the wrong condition." She wanted to ask why he was there, but something in his expression told her not to. He sat down at the same booth as before, his eyes scanning the familiar table. "I left something behind." "I know," she said. He looked up at her, caught off guard. She reached into her apron pocket and placed the ring in front of him. "I was waiting for you to come back." His fingers brushed the metal, slow, deliberate. "You kept it." "I didn't think you'd want the world finding it," she said softly. "Something tells me it means more than it looks." His jaw tightened, eyes falling to the engraving. "It does." He hesitated, then added, "It was my father's. He wore it until the day he died. Said it would remind him of the moment he stopped building walls and started building a life. I never managed to understand what he meant." Mara leaned on the counter, her voice almost a whisper. "Maybe you're starting to." He gave a faint, self-conscious laugh as if the thought embarrassed him. "I fired a waitress for spilling coffee on me once." She cried. "I didn't even remember her name." "Maybe that's why you're here," Mara said. He looked up again, and this time the control in his face cracked. "You think I came for forgiveness?" I think you came because you finally saw someone who didn't care who you were. The words landed with quiet weight. Outside, thunder rolled through the rain. Inside, his walls shifted, just enough for her to see the loneliness underneath. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he said softly, "You looked at me that day like you saw something worth saving." "I didn't see something to save," she replied. "I saw someone who still could." The air between them pulsed. No one else in the diner dared move. He exhaled slowly, running a thumb over the ring. "You have no idea what kind of world I live in, Mara. It eats people like you. People like me too, if I'm honest." "Then maybe it's time you stop living in that world," she said. He looked at her, really looked. Then he slipped the ring back into his pocket, like sealing a promise he didn't yet know how to keep. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Anything. Do you believe people can change?" She thought for a moment. "I think people can choose who they become, but not until they stop pretending they're fine." A flash of pain crossed his eyes. "That's harder than it sounds." "I know," she said quietly, "but I think you're already trying." Their eyes met again, longer this time, steady, unguarded, electric. He didn't look like a billionaire anymore. He looked like a man rediscovering the parts of himself he thought had died years ago. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, the diner lights reflected in the windows like small constellations. He broke the silence. "You know I can't stay long. I have a meeting across town." She smiled faintly. "You always have a meeting across town." He stood, hesitant. "But can I come back after?" She tilted her head, pretending to think. "Only if you don't make me your project." He smiled for real then, genuine, warm, almost boyish. "You'd never let me." As he turned to leave, she called softly, "Alexander." He paused, looking back. "You left the coffee half full again." His eyes softened. "Then I guess I'll have to return to finish it." She watched him walk out, the bell above the door jingling softly. When the sound faded, Mara pressed her hands against the counter to steady herself. For the first time, she wasn't sure who had just changed more, the billionaire who'd learned to feel, or the woman who'd stopped being afraid to. Outside, through the mist, his reflection lingered against the glass like a ghost of what was still unfinished between them, and for reasons she couldn't name, Mara smiled. Because some stories didn't need endings yet. They just needed another beginning. Alexander didn't return that night. Not the next, nor the one after. For 3 days, Mara convinced herself it was fine, that she'd imagined the spark in his eyes, that maybe the rain and the ring and the quiet conversation were just fragments of a strange dream. She told herself he was probably back in his world of glass towers and black-tinted cars, where emotions were inconvenient and sincerity was bad business. But deep down, she knew something in him had shifted, something that wasn't done yet. On the 4th evening, just before closing, the diner phone rang. Jamie answered, his voice echoing through the half-empty room. "Mara, someone's asking for you." She frowned, taking the receiver. "Hello?" A smooth, restrained voice came through. "It's Alexander." She froze. "How did you get this number?" I asked. "Politely, I might add," he said with a trace of humor that sounded foreign on him. "I was wondering if I could see you. Not at the diner. Somewhere quieter." She hesitated. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "Probably not," he admitted. "But sometimes the right things don't start with good ideas." That line disarmed her. Against her better judgment, she agreed to meet him after her shift. The next hours passed in slow motion. Every plate she washed, every order she took felt like part of a countdown she didn't fully understand. When the last customer left, she changed into her worn grey coat and stepped out into the cool night. He was there, leaning against a dark car parked across the street, his breath visible in the cold air, his expression unreadable but softer than before. "Mara," he greeted, his voice low, almost reverent. "You look out of place here," she said. "I feel it," he replied, "but I wanted to see you without walls this time." They walked without destination, their footsteps echoing on wet pavement. He told her about his father, the man who built an empire but couldn't build peace inside his home, about how he'd been taught that control was survival, that emotions were a currency he couldn't afford. And she listened, really listened, with the quiet empathy of someone who understood pain without judgment. At one point, she said softly, "You've been living like the world's a transaction. But people aren't accounts to be balanced, Alexander." He nodded slowly. "You're the first person to tell me that." They stopped by the riverfront, where city lights shimmered like broken stars. The air between them thickened, not with tension, but with the fragile electricity of two people learning each other's silence. He turned toward her. "You said once that people can choose who they become. What if I don't know how?" She met his gaze. "Then start small. Talk to people who don't need anything from you. Do something kind where no one's watching. And when it feels uncomfortable, that's how you'll know you're changing." He stared at her like she'd said something sacred. Then, almost reluctantly, he whispered, "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," she said, "but it's worth it." They stood there for a long while until the wind picked up. He offered to drive her home, and after some hesitation, she agreed. Inside the car, the silence felt heavier, intimate, vulnerable. As they pulled up in front of her building, she turned to thank him, but he spoke first. "There's a charity gala next week. My company's hosting it. Would you—" "Alexander," she interrupted gently, "you don't have to invite me into your world." He looked down. "Maybe I want to," she smiled sadly. "And maybe I don't belong there." "Why not?" "Because I'd rather meet you in places where no one's watching," she said. "Where you're not the billionaire everyone fears." His lips parted as if to argue, but instead he nodded. "Then I'll find you here." The words lingered like a promise as she stepped out. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Something about him haunted her, the contradiction between his power and his pain, his precision and his quiet vulnerability. She didn't want to be pulled into his world, but she couldn't deny that it had already reached into hers. Meanwhile, Alexander sat alone in his penthouse. The city stretched beneath him like a kingdom he no longer wanted to rule. He held his father's ring again, tracing the engraving with his thumb. "For the day I learned to feel again." For the first time in years, he wished he knew how. The next day he made a decision. He drove back to the diner, not in a limousine, not with assistance, but in an old car he hadn't used since college. When he entered, he didn't wear the billionaire's mask. He ordered coffee quietly and waited. Mara saw him from across the room, her breath catching slightly. He looked human, not polished, not guarded, just a man trying. When she approached, he smiled faintly. "You said to start small." "You remembered." He nodded. "So I left my phone in the car. No meetings, no headlines, just coffee." Her lips curved into a small, approving smile. "That's progress." They talked for over an hour about music, books, life before success. He told her he used to paint before business devoured his time. She told him she still wrote letters she never sent, to people she missed or forgave silently. At one point she laughed softly and said, "You know, if anyone told me I'd be having coffee with a man who owns half the skyline, I'd have called them crazy," he smirked. "And yet here you are." "Here I am," she replied, her tone more tender than she intended. Then his phone buzzed. A single glance and the warmth in his eyes dimmed. "It's the board." "I need to—" She stood before he could finish. "Then go." "I know what that world means to you." He hesitated. "That world feels less like mine every time I leave you." Her chest tightened, but she hid it behind a composed smile. "Then maybe that's how you know you're changing." He wanted to say something more, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he left a folded napkin beside his coffee cup before walking out. Mara picked it up, her heart thudding. On it, written in his precise handwriting, were 5 words that made her breath hitch. "Thank you for seeing me." The ink had smudged slightly from his touch, as if the emotion behind it couldn't quite stay contained. Mara held the napkin to her chest, her eyes stinging. Because in those few words she knew, this was no longer just curiosity or admiration. It was something much deeper, something neither of them were ready for, yet both were already falling into. The following days unfolded like something unspoken between them, an invisible rhythm, fragile but growing stronger. Alexander began showing up at the diner more often, though never in the same way twice. Sometimes he came early in the morning, dressed plainly, pretending to be just another customer who liked the smell of fresh coffee. Other times he arrived near closing, offering to help Mara stack chairs or mop the floor, though he was clearly terrible at both. Jamie teased her endlessly. "Are you sure he's not just here for the pie?" Mara rolled her eyes. "He's trying to be normal." Let him, but deep down she knew it wasn't about pie. Each visit peeled back another layer of the man who once seemed made of marble. The billionaire who'd once ordered her around with clipped commands was learning to ask, to listen, to laugh, and she was changing too. Against her own warnings, she found herself waiting for him, for the sound of the bell over the door, for that quiet smile that belonged only to her. She told herself it was friendship, maybe gratitude, but her heart whispered a different story. One evening, after the last customer left, he lingered by the counter. The dim lights reflected off his eyes like liquid gold. "Do you ever get tired of this?" he asked, glancing around. "Of what?" "The routine, the endless noise. Serving people who barely notice your name." She smiled softly. "I don't serve them for their attention, Alexander. I serve them because it's what I do with care. It's how I bring a little warmth into a cold day. That's enough." He leaned on the counter, watching her carefully. "That's what I envy about you. You don't do things for validation. You do them because they're right." She met his gaze. "You could too, you know." He chuckled faintly. "You make it sound easy." "It's not easy," she said, her voice low. "But it's honest." Something about that struck him. His eyes softened, and for a moment, the air between them shifted, electric, fragile, and undeniably intimate. He looked like he wanted to say something, but then his phone buzzed again. The moment cracked. He silenced it without looking, then said quietly, "Would you have dinner with me?" "Not at the diner. Somewhere quiet." "Just us." Mara hesitated, torn between the warmth in her chest and the whisper of self-preservation. "Alexander!" He held up a hand, a trace of vulnerability in his expression. No business talk, no boardrooms. Just a meal between two people who forgot how to be real. Her lips curved. "That's quite a sales pitch." I was hoping it was a plea. That made her laugh, and that laughter, soft, melodic, real, broke through something in him. "Fine," she said. "But I pick the place." He looked genuinely surprised. "You do?" "Yes, and you're not wearing a suit." He smiled, the kind of smile that reached the eyes and made him look younger, freer. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss Daniels." That's the point. The next night he met her at a small cafe near the outskirts of town, the kind of place with flickering candles and mismatched chairs. He arrived wearing jeans and a simple sweater, his hair slightly messy. For the first time, he didn't look like a man trying to control the world, just one trying to belong in it. When she saw him, her heart caught. "You clean up." "Less intimidatingly than expected," she said, grinning. "And you," he replied, taking in her modest floral dress, "look like sunlight decided to take human form." She blushed, shaking her head. "Careful. Flattery sounds like your old language." "Maybe," he said, eyes steady on hers. "But I mean every word." Dinner felt effortless. They spoke about childhood memories, embarrassing moments, dreams they hadn't admitted out loud. Alexander told her about the first business he started. Not a company, but a painting studio he abandoned because his father called it a waste of intellect. Mara shared how she used to sketch faces on napkins during breaks, imagining stories for strangers she'd never meet again. At one point, he looked at her sketching something on the tablecloth and asked, "What are you drawing?" "You," she said simply, "but not how you look." "How you are." He tilted his head, intrigued. "And how am I?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "Lonely." But learning not to be, he didn't answer. He just stared at her, emotion flickering through his eyes like fire behind glass. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full, heavy, alive. When they stepped outside later, a soft drizzle began to fall. She opened her umbrella, but he didn't move. Instead, he let the rain hit his face, closing his eyes for a moment as if remembering something long forgotten. "What are you doing?" she asked, amused. "Letting go," he murmured. "Of whatever this armor is I've been wearing." Mara smiled and joined him under the rain. "You're doing fine without it." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then quietly he reached out, not to grab her hand but to brush a raindrop from her cheek. His fingers lingered for a heartbeat too long. Their eyes locked, and in that second, everything unspoken between them became undeniable. "Mara," he whispered, his voice raw, "you make me feel like the world isn't something I own. It's something I finally understand." Her heart ached at the sincerity in his tone. "And you make me see that even people who seem untouchable still need to be seen." Neither moved. Neither dared to break the fragile balance between them. Then headlights flashed nearby, his driver waiting down the street. Reality slipped back in like cold air. He exhaled, regret flickering in his eyes. "I should go." I know, he hesitated. Will you still see me after this? She smiled faintly. That depends. On what? On whether you'll show up as the man I had dinner with tonight, or the one who hides behind his empire. He nodded, understanding exactly what she meant, and as he got into the car, he turned to look at her one last time through the rain-smeared window. She was still standing there, small, luminous and steady, the only person who'd ever looked at him without flinching. Inside the car, Alexander ran a hand over his face and whispered to himself, "She's changing everything." He didn't realize yet that she already had. The morning after their rain-soaked evening lingered in Alexander's thoughts, like a song he couldn't turn off. For the first time in years, he didn't wake up thinking about meetings, markets, or money. He thought about her laugh, under the drizzle. The way her eyes didn't look at him like he was a prize to win or a threat to fear. She looked at him like he was human, and he hadn't felt that in so long he'd almost forgotten what it meant. He tried to go back to his routine, the one he'd built like armor. His assistant, Grant, followed him through the marble halls of his office tower, reading updates from a tablet. The board wants to review the acquisition proposal today, and the press is still speculating about your absence from the gala. Alexander didn't answer. His gaze drifted toward the rain streaking the window. "Reschedule the meeting," he said finally. Grant stopped walking. "Sir, that's unprecedented." "Then consider today unprecedented," Alexander replied, voice calm but final. When Grant left, Alexander loosened his tie and sat by the window. Below him stretched the city he owned, at least the parts that mattered to his empire. But all he could think about was a small diner, 2 blocks from the river, and the woman inside who spoke truth to him without realizing the power she held. At lunch, he walked there without his car, without his entourage. Just a man in a grey coat, trying to find peace in the clatter of dishes and the smell of fresh bread. When he entered, Mara glanced up, surprise flashing briefly before softening into something warm. "You again," she said with a smile. He shrugged. "What can I say? You make good coffee. Pretty sure you can afford better. Maybe. But I can't afford genuine conversation." Her expression shifted, touched, a little uncertain. "You're not exactly easy to talk to, you know." "Then you must be extraordinary," he said, sliding into his usual seat. For a moment, neither spoke. The din around them faded into background noise, laughter, plates, the hum of an old jukebox. Then Mara set a cup of coffee in front of him and asked softly, "Why do you come here, Alexander? Really?" He met her eyes, the mask slipping just enough for honesty to show. "Because when I'm here, I remember who I wanted to be before the world told me I had to become someone else." Mara froze, the sincerity in his tone catching her off guard. "You don't talk like a rich man." "That's because the rich man you're thinking of doesn't exist anymore," he said quietly. She studied him, seeing the truth in the tired lines around his eyes. Beneath the tailored charm and steady control, there was loneliness, deep and unrelenting. It made her chest ache. "Then maybe," she said, "you should stop pretending he does." He gave a small, rueful smile. "You make it sound easy." "It's not, but you've already started." He looked down at his hands, remembering how she'd stood in the rain with him, unafraid. "You're not what I expected, Mara." "Good," she said. Expectations ruin people. Later that day, as she left her shift, she found him waiting by the door. He was leaning against a lamppost, hands in his pockets, looking nothing like the man who once ruled boardrooms. "You know," she teased, "if anyone sees you here this often, they'll start thinking you work for me." "Maybe that wouldn't be so bad," he said, walking beside her. "At least you'd pay me in smiles." She shook her head, laughing. "You're terrible at flirting." "I'm out of practice." They walked in silence for a while, the city's glow painting their faces in gold and blue. At a crosswalk, Mara turned to him. "You said once that I make you feel human again, but what about you, Alexander? What do you give to the world that makes you feel alive?" He hesitated. No one had ever asked him that, not like this. His voice came low. "I build, but I've spent years building walls instead of bridges." "Then start with one bridge," she said gently. "Maybe not for the world, just for yourself." He looked at her, something flickering behind his eyes. Hope, fear, longing. And what if I don't know how? Then you learn, like everyone else who's tired of being lonely. That night, after she left, Alexander went home and stood in his study surrounded by art, glass, and silence. Her words echoed in him. Then start with one bridge. He walked to his desk, opened a folder, and stared at a document he'd signed months ago. Plans to demolish the old community center downtown. He'd bought the property for expansion, but now he couldn't bring himself to approve it. Instead, he picked up a pen and wrote across the file in bold ink, "Project suspended until further notice." Grant called minutes later, confused. "Sir, are you sure? That project is worth millions." "I'm aware," Alexander said, voice steady. "But some things are worth more than money." He hung up before Grant could reply. The next morning, Mara found a newspaper folded on the counter at the diner. The headline read, "Billionaire halts demolition, funds community restoration." Jamie raised an eyebrow. "Your mysterious friend have something to do with that?" Mara pretended not to blush. "He's trying." When Alexander entered later that day, she didn't greet him with words. She just poured his coffee, placed it gently in front of him, and said, "You kept your promise." He smiled, eyes soft. "Maybe you're my good influence. Or maybe you're finally listening to your heart." He leaned forward. "It's easier to listen when you're the one speaking to it." For the first time, Mara didn't look away. The air thickened, not uncomfortable, but charged with something deeper. His gaze held hers like gravity. "Mara," he said quietly, "I've met thousands of people who wanted what I had. You're the first who made me want what I didn't." She swallowed, her heart hammering. "And what's that?" "Peace." The word fell between them, fragile and true. Before she could reply, a woman's voice cut through the air. "Alexander?" Mara turned. A tall, impeccably dressed woman stood by the door, holding a leather purse. Her tone carried the effortless confidence of someone used to power. Alexander's face tightened. "Sophie." Mara stepped back instinctively, sensing the shift. The woman approached, smiling coolly. "You've been hard to reach. Board's worried you've gone sentimental." "I've been busy," he said. "Clearly," Sophie said, glancing at Mara with polite disdain. "So this is where you've been hiding?" Mara looked between them, understanding dawning. "I should go." But Alexander reached out, his hand catching hers for a fleeting moment. "No, stay." His voice was steady, but his pulse wasn't. Sophie smirked. "You're seriously wasting time here, Alexander? With her?" Something inside Mara broke. Not from insult, but from the look of hesitation that flickered across his face. That tiny, uncertain pause said everything. She pulled her hand free and whispered, "You don't have to explain." "Mara, please." But she was already walking toward the kitchen door. Sophie's voice followed behind her like ice. "She'll get over it." "They always do." Alexander's jaw clenched. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure which world he belonged to. The one that demanded control, or the one that finally made him feel alive. And as the door closed behind Mara, he realized he might have just lost the only person who could teach him how to live. Mara didn't go back to the diner the next morning, or the next. By the third day, her co-workers stopped asking questions. Everyone had seen the scene unfold. The stranger in the tailored suit, the sharp-tongued woman who looked like she, belonged on magazine covers, and Mara standing there, trying not to look broken. She spent her days in quiet places now. The library, the park, anywhere people didn't ask how she was doing. It wasn't that she hated him, she just didn't know how to fit into his world. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash of hesitation in his gaze when Sophie spoke. That one pause was enough to tell her what she already feared. Love wasn't always enough when the world was watching. Alexander, meanwhile, couldn't escape the echo of her footsteps leaving. The city lights felt dimmer, his penthouse colder. Even his success tasted bitter. The day after Mara left, he cancelled 2 meetings and locked himself in his office, staring at the ring of coffee left on his desk from their last conversation. A tiny, imperfect circle that somehow meant more than all his wealth. Grant entered cautiously. "You've been off schedule for 3 days, sir." "I'm aware." Is it about the board or the waitress? Alexander shot him a look, but there was no anger behind it, just exhaustion. She has a name, Grant. Grant sighed. Then maybe you should use it to find her instead of staring at your reflection in the window. Alexander said nothing. But that night, he found himself driving aimlessly through the city until he reached the diner. It was closed. Lights off, chairs stacked upside down. Through the window, he could see the faint outline of her section, where she used to move like music through chaos, her hair tied back, her eyes alive. He stood there in the rain, hand resting on the glass, realizing what he'd done. He hadn't just hurt her, he'd proven every fear she ever had about people like him. Back in his car, he stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. For once, he didn't see the billionaire, the tycoon, the man people feared. He saw a man who'd spent a lifetime building walls high enough to keep love out. He drove to the community center project, the one she had inspired him to save, and walked inside. Construction had already begun. The smell of sawdust and rain hung in the air. The foreman looked surprised. "Mr. Hale, didn't expect you tonight." Alexander nodded absently. "Keep it going. Double the crew if you need to. I want it open before Christmas." "Understood. Any reason for the rush?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "Someone reminded me that people need places where they can feel human." Later at home, he sat at his desk and wrote something he hadn't written in years. A letter. No lawyers, no assistants, just him and his thoughts. The words came slowly, but they came from a place deeper than he'd ever reached before. "Mara, you once told me to start building bridges. I didn't understand what that meant, until I burned the one that led to you. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you know that meeting you changed the man I am, even if it took losing you to see it." Alexander, he left the letter at the diner's door before sunrise, sealed in an envelope marked only with her name. When Mara arrived later that morning, she found it lying on the step. She hesitated before opening it. Her heart ached as she read each line. The restraint, the remorse, the sincerity that didn't sound like the man she met that first day. By the time she finished, the paper was damp from tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. She didn't write back. She didn't know what to say. But the letter stayed in her apron pocket for weeks, folded and worn. Winter crept in. The diner filled with cold winds and empty seats. One afternoon, Jamie burst through the door with a newspaper in hand. "Mara, you need to see this." The headline read, "Community Center reopens under new name. The Hale Foundation dedicates it to local workers." Below the headline was a photograph of Alexander standing beside a newly unveiled plaque. The inscription read, "For those who remind us that kindness is power." Her chest tightened. She looked out the window, snowflakes swirling like ash against the gray sky. Maybe he had changed. Maybe this was what he meant by building bridges. That evening, as she closed the diner, she noticed headlights flash outside. A black car idled by the curb. Her pulse quickened, part fear, part hope. The door opened and Alexander stepped out. No entourage, no arrogance, just a man holding a small box. "Mara," he said, voice barely audible in the cold air. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "I know, but I needed to see you." She crossed her arms, holding herself steady. "What do you want from me, Alexander?" He looked down for a moment before lifting his gaze again. "A second chance, not at love, not yet. Just a chance to prove I meant every word I wrote." "And what makes you think I believe you?" "Because I built that center for you," he said softly. "For the people you remind me to see. I don't want credit. I just want to live in a world you'd be proud of." The sincerity in his eyes disarmed her. Still, she shook her head. "You can't buy redemption." "I'm not trying to buy it. I'm trying to earn it." For a long moment, neither spoke. Snow fell between them like time itself, fragile, unstoppable. Then he held out the box. Inside wasn't jewelry or anything extravagant. It was her ring. The small, simple one she'd lost weeks ago. "I found it in my car," he said quietly. "I didn't know what it was at first, but I think it found its way there for a reason." Her hand trembled as she took it. "You kept it." "It reminded me of you." Unassuming but impossible to forget. Mara looked up at him. This man who once ruled his world with logic and precision, now standing in the snow like a boy who'd finally learned humility. Something inside her cracked open. Maybe, she said softly. Some bridges can be rebuilt. A small smile tugged at his lips. Then tell me where to start. She hesitated, then nodded toward the diner behind her. With dinner. As a customer. Nothing more. I can live with that, he said. He followed her inside, the warmth of the diner melting the chill from their hands. She poured him coffee, just like the first day. Only this time neither of them were pretending. As he lifted the cup, his eyes caught hers, the same quiet depth, the same unspoken promise that maybe this time they both knew what they were risking. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the world in white, as if forgiving it for everything that came before. The snow didn't stop for days. The city slowed to a hush, streets wrapped in white silence. Inside the diner, however, there was warmth, the hum of the heater, the scent of coffee, and the quiet rhythm of something mending between two people who'd once been worlds apart. Alexander sat by the window most mornings now, not to be seen, but to remember what it felt like to simply exist. No phone calls, no board meetings, no entourage. Just the scrape of Mara's shoes on tile and the sound of her laughter drifting from the counter. It wasn't love yet, not in the way people rushed to name it, but something more honest. It was patience, trust, the fragile courage to begin again without knowing how it might end. One evening, when the snow had thinned to a soft drizzle, Mara joined him after closing. The lights were dim, the world outside blurred by fog. She brought 2 mugs of cocoa instead of coffee. "You're early tonight," she said, sitting opposite him. He smiled faintly. "I didn't want to wait another morning." She studied him. His posture was still composed, but the arrogance that once wrapped around him like armor was gone. "I've changed," she said quietly. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just learning who I was supposed to be." Mara traced the rim of her cup with her finger. "That's a hard thing to admit." "I had to lose you to do it," he replied. Her chest tightened at his words. For months she'd built walls of her own, telling herself men like him couldn't change, that feelings like hers were foolish. But now, sitting across from him, she saw something she hadn't before. Vulnerability. Real, raw, unpolished. "You know," she said after a moment, "most people would have walked away. You didn't have to come back." "I did," he said simply. "Because you were right. Money never made me powerful. People did. People who saw something in me even when I couldn't." Her eyes softened. "And what do you see now?" He hesitated, looking down at his reflection in the cocoa. "Someone still learning to deserve forgiveness." Mara leaned back, studying him with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. "You don't need to earn forgiveness, Alexander. You just have to mean it." A silence settled between them, comfortable this time. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Somewhere outside, a car passed, tires hissing on wet pavement. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I never told you," she said, placing it on the table, "but I wrote you back. I just never sent it." He looked surprised, then unfolded the letter carefully. Her handwriting was small and neat. "Alexander, when I first met you, I thought you were everything wrong with the world. Cold, untouchable, careless with people's hearts. But then I saw what you were underneath, someone afraid to be seen. I'm not angry anymore. I just hope you find what you've been running from." He looked up at her, eyes glistening. "Did I?" She smiled faintly. "That's for you to decide." He folded the paper again, his hands trembling slightly. "Then maybe I already have." The next weeks passed quietly. The diner became his refuge and hers too. He helped her repaint the back room, repaired a broken neon sign, and learned how to make coffee the way she did, strong but never bitter. News eventually broke that the billionaire Alexander Hale had been spotted working at a local diner. It became a story the city couldn't stop talking about. Cameras waited outside some mornings, hoping to capture a headline. But every time a reporter asked, Alexander would just smile and say, "I'm just here for the coffee." What none of them understood was that it wasn't coffee that brought him back every day. It was the peace he'd never been able to buy. The peace that came from being near someone who saw the man before the money. Spring arrived early that year. The snow melted, the city unfroze, and the community center he'd built finally opened its doors. He invited Mara, though she hadn't promised to come. The night of the ceremony, he stood before the crowd, city officials, cameras, investors, but his eyes kept searching the back of the room. And then he saw her, standing quietly by the doorway in a simple blue dress, her hair loose, her eyes shining. He stepped to the podium, the murmurs fading as he began to speak. I spent most of my life believing that success was measured in numbers, profit, status, ownership. But someone once taught me that what matters most can't be owned. It can only be shared. This building isn't just for me. It's for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong in someone else's world. Because kindness changes everything. The applause that followed was thunderous, but his eyes stayed on Mara. She didn't clap. She just smiled. The same quiet, knowing smile that had once undone him across a diner counter. After the event, he found her outside beneath the streetlights. The night air carried the scent of rain and lilacs. "You came," he said softly. "I told myself I wouldn't," she admitted. "But I wanted to see if you meant what you said." "And?" She looked up at him, eyes luminous. "You did." They stood in silence for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A ring. "Not a diamond, not gold. Just a simple silver band. I don't expect an answer," he said. "But I want you to have this, as a promise, that I'll never stop trying to be the man you saw in me." She took the ring, her fingers brushing his. "You already are," she whispered. He stepped closer, his voice barely audible. "Then let me show you." The world seemed to hold its breath as she looked into his eyes, those same eyes that had once hidden everything and now held nothing back. She smiled, tears glinting under the lamplight. "I think," she said softly, "we've both spent enough time pretending." And then, under the soft hum of the city and the distant murmur of applause, she reached up and kissed him. Not the way stories say, not grand, not dramatic, but tender, certain, human. The kind of kiss that ends a war. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his breath trembling. "I don't deserve this." "Maybe not," she said gently. "But sometimes love isn't about deserving, it's about choosing." He closed his eyes, letting her words settle inside him like peace. For once, Alexander Hale, the man who had everything, realized he'd finally found the one thing money could never buy: redemption through love. As they walked away together, the city lights flickered like quiet blessings behind them. Two lives rewritten not by wealth, but by the courage to begin again. Subscribe to be part of stories that still believe in love.